For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is unveiling Jesus Christ.
Welcome to this video log. I'm John Cassinat, and I'll be your tour guide as we look at images from the Izmir province in Turkey. In this video, I'll be talking about the religious history in the area of ancient Ephesus. This area was historically known as Asia Minor, but it's also been known as the Kingdom of Lydia, Ionia, Anatolia, and the modern empire more recently before becoming modern Turkey. I'll be speaking about the religious history in this area through photographic images focused on the Temple of Artemis, the Church of the Virgin Mary, the ancient city of Ephesus, focusing primarily on the activities of the Apostle Paul, and we'll end up at the Basilica of St. John in the modern city of Selçuk, where I'll talk about the ruins of that basilica and its connection to John the Revelator. So let's begin our discussion with the Temple of Artemis. This temple was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, but it no longer exists today. Outside the place where it once existed, you can find this shrine. To be honest, I don't know whether this is something that's old or new. All I know is it's kind of a marker that tells you where you can see the place where the temple once stood. We didn't actually stop and look at the location of the Temple of Artemis because there's not that much to see. There's only a solitary pillar that remains, but I'm going to use this topographic model to give some idea of the location of this temple in proximity to the ancient city of Ephesus. The white arrow is pointing to a valley between two sizable hills or mountains. To the south, or at the top of the photograph, is Mount Coressos, and to the north, coming down, is Mount Pion with the valley in between them. You may recall that the amphitheater in ancient Ephesus was built into the south side of Mount Pion, and then on the north side is that geologic fault that caused so many earthquakes and resulted in the ultimate destruction of the Temple of Artemis. The red star you see is location for the ancient city of Ephesus, or what I refer to as Ephesus number 3. It gets a red star because it was the capital city during the Roman era, or for a good portion of it. Right below the red star you can see an outline where the harbor used to come in as part of the Aegean Sea that ultimately filled in and became a marsh. As we zoom out in our topographic model, you can see the outline of the harbor that comes around the south end of Mount Pion and up another little area, which is where the Temple of Artemis was located. The arrow is pointing to the Ayasaluk Hill in Selçuk. This is the location of the Basilica of St. John, and it looks over the little valley where the Temple of Artemis was located. The photographs that you'll see of the location are all taken from the Basilica of St. John. Here we are looking down from the Basilica of St. John on the little valley I've been talking about where the Temple of Artemis was located. In a minute I'll show you the fault lines that existed in this valley. The hills, you can kind of see in between the two trees there, but I'm going to zoom in. The pictures will look a little bit grainy because it's a pretty far distance to go. Here's the actual fault line that I'm showing with a red arrow that caused all of these earthquakes. This is just the visible part of it, obviously, more than what we're just looking at here, but that's on the north side of Mount Pion. And one more photo and I'll be able to show you the fault line a little bit more clearly in this last photograph. The Temple of Artemis would be located a very, very short distance from that fault line, represented by a solitary pillar that still exists in the area. So here's the fault line shown by this arrow, and then if you look down just a little further you can see the arrow now pointing at the one pillar that remains, and this we're kind of zooming in on it here a little bit to get an idea of where the temple was. I now want to turn my attention to the history of the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, but before doing so, just a quick background about Artemis herself. She was the goddess of nature, childbirth, wildlife, healing, hunting, animals, virginity, young women, archery. I mean, she did it all. Her Roman equivalent was the goddess Diana. So in Greek mythology, Artemis is the daughter of Zeus by another goddess by the name of Leto, and she was the twin sister of Apollo. Artemis is presented as a hunting goddess of the woods, and so some of the statues you see of her will have that. Other statues include the many-breasted images indicating her fertility and childbirth, things of that nature. She was one of the most widely venerated goddesses of the ancient Greek deities, and her worship spread throughout ancient Greece. There are multiple temples, altars, and shrines. I'm now going to talk about the history of the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus by showing a video clip of the location where this temple was built originally. The original temple was of modest size, but it was destroyed in 650 BC. Reconstruction began in about 550 BC, but was again destroyed by fire in 356 BC. The rebuilding started this time on a grander scale, but was incomplete by the time Alexander the Great came to power in the Greek Empire. He finished the massive structure in the 3rd century BC, which I described separately in my vlog that I did on the history of Ephesus. This is a photograph of a model of what the Temple of Artemis was thought to look like. It stood on a platform of 425 feet by about 239 feet. It had 127 marble pillars that were 56 feet high and 6 feet thick. 36 of these columns were sculptured and overlaid with gold, and the temple itself was 342 feet by 163 feet. And if you're kind of keeping track, the length was longer than a football field. So the temple earned the city the title Servant of the Goddess. Pliny, who was a Roman historian, says it took 120 years to build. It's 4 times larger than the Pantheon in Rome. The temple was built on that marshy area that I've kind of talked about where the harbor used to be, and it was thought that if they built it there, it would protect the structure from earthquakes. If you can imagine this, before the harbor completely silted up, the Aegean came right up to one of the sides of this temple. Now, the temple also had a treasury and became famous for making loans with interest, and so it became a source of great revenue because they were collecting a lot of money from the pilgrims who would come to the temple. And this all occurred back in the days of the Lydians, who printed coins for the first time. Ultimately, the Temple of Artemis was destroyed by earthquakes, and the Goths, that Germanic tribe who destroyed the temple in 262 AD, the ruins of the temple were reused in other building projects, and today only foundations and some column fragments remain, as well as the one solitary and inconspicuous column that you've seen before. The temple was located through archaeological excavation by the British Museum for the first time in the 1870s, and portions of the temple have been taken to the British Museum. We're now leaving the lowlands of Selkirk in the Izmir province and traveling to the house of the Virgin Mary on the Bulbil Mountain. It stands at an elevation of about 1,320 feet on a mountain that has a summit of 1,575 feet. The house is located between Ephesus, which is about 8 kilometers away, and Kusadasi, which is about 4 kilometers away. It's one of the few places where you can see both the Aegean Sea and ancient Ephesus from the same location. In about 1951, a road was built to make the place accessible to pilgrims and tourists. So the question is really whether this is the place where Mary lived when she was in Ephesus, and the short answer is I don't know, but it was a very nice setting that was not overrun with a lot of commercialism. There were a couple of gift shops whose proceeds go to the maintenance of the grounds, but if I compare the house of the Virgin Mary with, for example, the place of the Nativity in Bethlehem, it's a world of difference. in the nativity scene, there's all these icons and statues, and commercialism are really over the top, and I was kind of disappointed. But I was not disappointed by what I saw and felt in this place. So if you ask the Catholic Church today, they're going to have several reasons for telling you that the house of the Virgin Mary is located on the Bulbil Mountain in the Izmir province, and they have several reasons for doing so. First, Mary's presence in Ephesus was first mentioned by Epiphanes, a 4th century historian. He said that Mary, the mother of Jesus, may have spent her last years in Ephesus, and the Ephesians derive the argument from John's presence himself there in Ephesus and Jesus' instruction to John at the time of his crucifixion that he was taking responsibility for the care of his mother Mary. This is stated in John 19 verses 26 through 27, where it says, quote, "When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by whom he loved, he said unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. Then saith he to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour that disciple took her unto his own home." Close quote. So Epiphanius, the historian, points out that while the Bible says that John was leaving for Asia, it does not specifically state that Mary went with him. However, that same historian later stated that Mary was buried in Jerusalem. So it's a big question mark. Since the 19th century, the house of the Virgin Mary has been considered to be her last home before her assumption into heaven. The tradition is that Mary traveled with John to Ephesus by no later than 42 AD. Records from the Ephesus Ecumenical Council in 431 AD state that John and Mary came to Ephesus between 37 and 48 AD, and that John built a house for Mary in the forest of the Bulbil Mountain where she died. Proofs that this is the place include the following. First, church law back then in the Catholic Church prohibited building a church to venerate a saint unless they lived or died there. Since this church venerates Mary, the mother of Jesus, she must have lived there. The local tradition of the people from the village of Kirkinji, which is now the village of Surens, housed the last descendants of the Ephesian Christians. They took refuge in these mountains and hills around Ephesus during the Seljuk or Muslim invasions in the 11th century AD. In 1892, over 4,000 of them gathered, according to the yearly tradition, to the chapel in the Bulbil Mountain. It was called then Panaya Kapulu, which is a partly Greek, partly Turkish word meaning House of Our Lady. There's a yearly procession on August 15th, which was, according to the Catholics, the day of her ascension. The house eventually fell into ruin until its rediscovery. This occurred when an Augustinian nun by the name of Catherine Ann Emmerich, who lived from 1774 to 1824, had a dream. Now, she was partially disabled and lived in Germany, had no ability to ever travel outside the country, but she had this dream about the tortures of Christians and the flight of John and Mary to Ephesus. And in her dream, she also saw the house of Mary in the mountains near Ephesus, and she described the house and the location with great detail from her dream. She said also that Mary lived at Ephesus 9 years before she died at the age of 64. So in 1891, based on Catherine's description from her dream about the place, there was a delegation of monks and priests that were sent to look for the house based on the description, and they discovered the ruins. And many Catholic theologians since then agree that this was the place of Mary's house. The floors and the foundations date to about the 1st century AD, although the walls are only dated to the 6th or 7th centuries AD, which suggests that the house that we see today was not there, although the foundations suggest that it could have been her residence. Pope Benedict the 14th, who was Pope from 1740 through 1758, said it is the place where Mary ascended into heaven. Pope John the 23rd, who reigned from 1958 to 1963, declared this place as a place for pilgrimage, and it's been visited by 3 popes between 1967 and 2006. As we get ready to leave the Church of the Virgin Mary, we come back to the fundamental question of whether this was Mary's home in Ephesus before she passed away. I'm not sure of the answer to that question, but it is the kind of place where I hope she could have lived her final years. Okay, we're going to head back down the Bulbul Mountain to the ancient city of Ephesus for a discussion of first century Christianity and the missionary activities of Paul in particular. Ephesus was an important center for early Christianity since about 50 AD. In 52 to 54 AD, the Apostle Paul lived in Ephesus, where he organized missionary activities in the outlying areas in Asia Minor. He attended the Jewish synagogue in Ephesus as recorded in the book of Acts, but after about 3 months, he became frustrated with the stubborn Jews. He then moved his teachings to the school of Tyrannus that's referred to in Acts 19 verse 9, which says, quote, "But when divers were hardened and believed not, but spake evil of that way before the multitude, he departed from them and separated the disciples, disputing daily in the school of one Tyrannus." Close quote. Now, we don't know the location of a building by the name of Tyrannus in the ancient city of Ephesus, but we do know that Tyrannus was the place where distinguished scholars would teach. They were eager to talk about the emperor's god cult and pagan cults, and the emperor god cult probably began with Augustus in 31 BC, and by the 1st century AD, the emperors had become more vain and ambitious, and cities curried favor by building temples to the emperors. It essentially got them exempted from taxes and military service, which was a big deal because military service was for like 20 years. And so the scholars pushed emperor worship for many advantages, and this occurred in the Tyrannus, or the cult building as it's referred to. Paul could only teach in the Tyrannus building during the hot hours of the day. It says from the 5th to the 10th hours, which was about 11 a.m. to about 4 p.m. The hall was normally vacant during this time because it's not the prime time, and perhaps the rent was less. I don't know if he was paying rent, but the peasants would be the only ones who would be hearing him during these hot hours of the day. But of course, they were happy to have someone, anyone who would preach to them, and they, of course, were those who were going to be willing receivers of the gospel in any event. The nobles and rich people would go to the place to listen to scholars expound during the cool hours of the day, which we'd consider to be prime time. Paul's teachings about Jesus Christ and against polytheism in Ephesus caused some revolts and riots by the silversmiths who created statues to the goddess Artemis, and I've talked about how Paul was teaching in the Agora in my last video log. But at any rate, to embellish this just a little bit, there was a silversmith by the name of Demetrios who stirred up a mob against Paul and complained that Paul was endangering their livelihood of making Artemis shrines. And so after this, Paul left Ephesus to resume his missionary activities in Corinth. I'll do a future video log of Paul's Corinthian activities at a later time. I can say in passing that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in the New Testament from Ephesus sometime between 53 and 57 AD during his third missionary journey. Paul also wrote his letter to the Ephesians found in the New Testament while he was in prison in Rome around 62 AD. John the Revelator also had a significant presence in Ephesus both before his banishment to the island of Patmos and again after his return from that island. I've done several podcasts on John and his connection to Ephesus, so if you check out my Come Follow Me podcast number 6 from November 5th of 2023, I talk about his letter to the Ephesians in the context of Revelation 2, 1 through 7, which is the first of the 7 cities that John wrote to. So I've done several podcasts on these verses as well, on January 28th, February 3rd, 4th, and February 10th, all in 2024. These podcasts cover the first 7 verses in Revelation chapter 2, where I talk about the letter that John wrote to the church at Ephesus when he was banished to the island of Patmos. This occurred in about 96 AD. After he wrote the book of Revelation, John returned to the city of Ephesus, when he then wrote his gospel and his 3 epistles from this same location. So these were all written after the book of Revelation. On a couple other related matters, Eusebius, a Roman historian, tells us that Timothy was the first bishop of Ephesus. There was also a bishop by the name of Polycrates in the 2nd century, who's best known for his letter addressed to the bishop in Rome, who has since been referred to as Pope Victor I. And in this letter, Polycrates was defending the Quartodeciman position in the Easter controversy. Now, this was a dispute over when Easter was supposed to occur. The Christians in Jerusalem were celebrating it the 14th day of the first month of Nisan, while the Christians in Rome were celebrating it the Sunday after the vernal equinox. So another point was, early in the 2nd century, Bishop Ignatius of Antioch wrote a letter to the Ephesians which states, quote, "To the church which is at Ephesus in Asia, deservedly most happy, being blessed in the greatness and fullness of God the Father, and predestined before the beginning of time, that it should be always for an enduring and unchangeable glory." Close quote. Needless to say, the predictions about the glory of the saints in Ephesus were all wrong, and they contradicted John's stern warning in the book of Revelation to the Ephesians who had lost their first love and were counseled to return again to the Savior. So that never happened, and so we're looking now at the ruins in the ancient city of Ephesus, where there was no Christian presence then and now. Ignatius was ultimately condemned to death for his faith in Jesus Christ, and he was being taken to Rome at the time of his martyrdom in the presence of 10 soldiers, whom he described in a letter before his death, saying, quote, "From Syria even unto Rome, I fight with beasts both by land and sea, both by night and day, being bound to 10 leopards, I mean a band of soldiers." Close quote. So that was the end of Ignatius, and that's the end of our discussion about the religious history of Ephesus. We're now going to head off to the Basilica of St. John, which is also located in the city of Selçuk in the Izmir province in Turkey. The basilica is built on a hill called the Ayasofya, which became Selçuk in 1950, which is also the name for the modern city. It's about 2.2 miles from ancient Ephesus. During my discussion of the Temple of Artemis, I kind of pointed out the relative locations of these things. The hill also took the name of Hagios Theologos, which means holy theologian. The name is attributed to its connection with John the Apostle. During the Roman era, the hill overlooking the area was used as a necropolis, which is a burial ground. The historian Eusebius states that the apostles all left Jerusalem sometime between 37 and 42 AD, and that Mary accompanied John to Ephesus, as I discussed in my earlier part of this video log. The tradition is that he also wrote his gospel from this particular location, and coincidentally it's also a tradition that here he wrote his last will and testament, which kind of contradicts the New Testament promise that John would tarry until the second coming. But in any event, when he supposedly died at the age of 90 plus in Ephesus, the tradition is that he was buried here in the location of what is now the Basilica of St. John, and we'll be looking at his tomb as we go through this video log. During the 4th century, this structure was just a modest church that had been built on this site by the Emperor Theodosius. The first building on John's tomb was essentially a mausoleum of sorts and also served as a church, but 2 centuries later it lay in ruins due to earthquakes. Little is known about the original basilica except for a short description by Procopius, who was a prominent Greek scholar and historian from Caesarea Maritima. He was a principal Roman historian of the 6th century, and he wrote, quote, "There chanced to be a certain place before the city of Ephesus, lying on a steep slope, hilly and bare of soil and incapable of producing crops, even should one attempt to cultivate them, but altogether hard and rough. On that site the natives had set up a church in early times to the Apostle John. This apostle has been named the Theologian, because the nature of God was described by him in a manner beyond the unaided power of man. This church, which was small and in a ruined condition because of its great age, the Emperor Justinian tore down to the ground and replaced by a church so large and beautiful that, to speak briefly, it resembles very closely in all respects and is a rival to the shrine which is dedicated to all the apostles in the imperial city." Close quote. Now, his reference to the imperial city was to Constantinople, and he notes that the land around the church was very uninhabitable and could not be used to cultivate anything. So Justinian had an aqueduct built near the church that greatly helped the city and allowed the area around the church to flourish through the centuries. Now, during the Byzantine era, which begins after the time of Constantine the Great in the 4th century, the basilica was rebuilt on the slopes of the Iasolic Hill and below what is known as the Iasolic Castle. This castle was built during the 6th century with reconstruction during the Ottoman period. It's not open to the public, but as I've been showing you in some of these photographs, I was able to take some images from the basilica where we could look up and basically see the walls above us. As noted by Procopius, the Byzantine basilica was constructed by Justinian I and his wife Theodora. Justinian lived from 527 to 565 AD. The basilica he built was the largest building in ancient Ephesus after the Temple of Artemis, and I hasten to add the Ephesus that I'm referring to here is Ephesus number 2, not the final Ephesus, whose ruins we've seen a lot of. By way of comparison, the Justinian basilica was 91,000 square feet, whereas the Theodosian basilica from earlier days was only 36,000 square feet. Justinian's construction began by 548 AD and was completed by his death in 565 AD. After its completion, this basilica was regarded as one of the holiest churches of its time. The construction of the building was done by imperial order, but the people of Ephesus did much of it. The basilica was a multi-domed structure in a cruciform design, which means if you had your drone taking pictures from above, the shape of the building would look like a cross. As noted by Procopius, it looked like the Church of the Apostles in Constantinople. It had 6 domes that rested on solid piers with a large center dome. John's crypt was located beneath the large center dome. Now, to hold these domes in place, massive marble pillars had to be built, as seen in this photograph. The basilica could be entered from the south side through the Gate of Persecution. It's called this because of reliefs in the original structure that showed battle scenes in ancient Greek history. However, those scenes were interpreted as scenes from the life of Paul and other Christians, and therefore it was given the name Gate of Persecution through this wrongful attribution to Paul and others. Adjacent to the Gate of Persecution, you'll see the outer wall built around the basilica in the 8th century AD to protect against Arab raiders. It was probably built from stones taken from the Temple of Artemis. Justinian built the inner walls of the basilica that you see here in the 6th century AD. Some of the interesting features of the basilica include the following. There is a massive apse, which is a semicircle recess in the back of the basilica. You can see 2 walls behind the apse where they've got these vaulted tunnels. These were probably created so that the priest or clergyman could prepare the sacraments and do other things of this nature. Over the top of a door, there is an inscription with Greek letters ICHTHYS. It's kind of like an acronym for the word fish, but if you break the letters down, it means Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is our Savior. On the north side of the church, there is a large octagonal baptistry resembling that found in the Church of the Virgin Mary. Interestingly, you can see that we have a font with steps going down where baptisms by immersion could occur. This basilica, as noted, was finished in 565 AD, and the first official approval of sprinkling in the Catholic Church occurred in 753 AD, or about 200 years later. This occurred when Pope Stephen announced alternative modes of baptism that were acceptable in cases of necessity. However, in 1311 AD, at the Council of Ravenna, the Catholic Church accepted sprinkling in all circumstances. So, at any rate, the baptistry or baptismal font that you see here suggests that there were baptisms by immersion occurring in the basilica at the time it was completed in the 6th century AD. Near the baptismal font, there was a rectangular room. It had a marble floor and an apse paved with all kinds of mosaics. An inscription identified this as the secreton. That's where the bishop would be when he presided as a judge. As you can see in other images, the basilica is built almost entirely of brick and a type of stone called ashlar. The columns would have been made of marble or would have been marble plated. There are also Orthodox icons or paintings visible in the treasury next to the baptistry. A bishop by the name of Hypatius from Ephesus was known for advocating the use of icons. On the west side of the basilica, there is a yard and covered portico with an atrium. Our guide said this is the place where John lived in Ephesus, although I have my doubts. This seems like kind of a high society kind of place to be living in. I'm not sure that would match the lifestyle that I envision for John the Apostle. But at any rate, there's a large cistern located in this area with 3 pools. The area was used as a storage place for materials while they were building the Isa Bay Mosque that you can see down below the basilica. This mosque is located basically between the basilica and the ruins of the Temple of Artemis. It was built in about 1375 AD, and after the construction of the mosque, the basilica kind of lost its importance. It lost its importance because when the Isa Bay Mosque was completed in 1375, the St. John's Basilica was actually in use as a mosque at that time. And so with the construction of the new mosque, they moved the worship services down to Isa Bay, and that meant that there was really nothing that the St. John's Basilica had a use for as far as the Muslims were concerned. Now, I mentioned that the basilica is believed to have been built over the ruins of the earlier city of Ephesus, meaning Ephesus number 1. It's also the site where John was said to have been buried. Directly beneath the altar of the basilica, there are several rooms and a crypt. On the altar, there's an inscription from Psalms 132:14, which says, quote, "This is my resting place forever. Here will I dwell." Close quote. Now, if you go back and look at my podcast that I did back on September 30, 2023, that's my Come Follow Me number 1, I talk about John's translation and the promise to him by Jesus Christ that he would tarry until the second coming. So it's all kind of a debatable point here depending on what religion you belong to. I asked our guide whether this was the actual burial place for John the Evangelist, and he told me that Turkish scholars will say that John the Revelator was not even John the Evangelist, but they're going to say this is the place where he was buried. The Greeks will say that it is on Patmos Islands, and the Catholics, of course, say, no, this is definitely the place. On July 26, 1967, Pope Paul VI venerated the church, and you can see here the sign memorializing the fact that that occurred. Now there's this legend from the Middle Ages that before John died, he was visited by Christ and other apostles who said, "Come, my beloved one, and join me and all the other brethren of thine at my table. The time has finally come to do so. The Sunday next, thou wilt come to stay henceforth with me." The next Sunday, John continued with his preaching and entered a cave of his church, whereupon there was this intense light that shone upon him, and the light prevented his disciples from entering the cave with him. When the light dissipated, so did John. And the moral of the story is that John was taken to heaven without tasting death, in a certain sense. When his tomb was opened during Constantine's reign, it yielded no body or relics, which are essentially bones, suggesting the truth of the mythology that came before that time. Another fact advances the legend of St. John's assumption into heaven. That is, all other saints' bodies or relics have been claimed by a city or church. However, in the case of St. John, along with Mary, the mother of Jesus, these are the only saints whose bodies have not been claimed. It's also said that St. John was not dead in, but sleeping beneath his tomb. Each time he breathed, he would cause dust around the altar to stir. This in turn made the dust holy and could cure the sick. It was called manna. So stories of John and the manna healings continued to grow, which resulted in pilgrimages to the Basilica of St. John. This caught the attention of St. Augustine Willibald, who was a bishop, and he was the first of many recorded pilgrims to the tomb. Every year on the 8th of May, there's this all-night festival honoring John, and it's been going on for like 1,000 years. So ultimately, the pilgrims who journeyed to Ephesus did not leave empty-handed. They brought flasks that were produced and had St. John's tomb on their image, and they used to collect dust with these flasks around St. John's tomb, and the dust would then be carried back to the pilgrims' respective homeland, and it was said to have cured sickness, calmed storms on land or sea. So that's some of the mythology associated with the death and or assumption of John the Beloved. Getting back to the basilica itself, it collapsed during an earthquake at the end of the 14th century, and the first excavations of the site occurred between 1921 and 1922, and we can thank those excavations for the condition of the basilica as we see it now today. That concludes my discussion about the religious history in the area of Ephesus. I thank you for watching and listening, sharing and subscribing, and I will see you in my next video log that will discuss the little village of Syrinx, also located in the Izmir province of Turkey.